a special episode of the Fertility Podcast. I have been umming and ahhing as to what best to do to try and capture my 5th birthday of the podcast 5 years ago. Rookie Natalie, rookie in the podcast sense, because I'd been on the radio for quite a while, so there wasn't the nerves about talking like this. Rookie Natalie in the podcast sense launched the Fertility Podcast, this very podcast, like this. Hi, and welcome to the Fertility Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to make fertility awareness so much more than it is. It's still taboo. People are very private if they are going through treatment. This podcast is for both men and women who have unanswered questions about fertility. There's going to be interviews with fertility experts from the UK, Europe and across the globe, as well as stories, everyday stories from you, from me, just so that this podcast is a place that if you have any fertility struggles going on in your world, this is a place you can come to. Maybe your questions will be answered. You can also put your questions forward to the different experts that I'm going to be speaking to. Well, I certainly did that. There's over 230 episodes now of the Fertility Podcast with a whole host of experts, as well as people like you, men and women that have shared their stories with me. And I honestly never expected to still be making this podcast 5 years on, to the point that actually the way that I'm making this episode is so unplanned, because I just wanted to, I suppose, capture what I was feeling, because I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do with this podcast, because it's been a really personal thing for me, sharing my stuff along the way, as well as having the privilege to speak to you and the multitude of experts that have given up their time. And I've learned so much, and I've made so many kind of amazing friends and made so many brilliant connections, and it's really opened my eyes up to this world, the fertility world. I've got so many more ideas of things I want to do. But one thing that is really important to me in all the work that I've been doing with this podcast is to be true to myself, to be authentic. And for the first year of the podcast, if you haven't made it back to the start, if you've just maybe found me, I was sharing this podcast anonymously because I didn't know how to be totally open with what I was trying to talk about. And I think this is like a key thing for a lot of us dealing with this. It's how we let it define us, because it's not all we are at all. But if it is something that we choose to become more vocal about, whether your chosen platform is Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you found it, whether you're writing a blog, keep on doing it. Keep on. If it's helping you, keep on with it, however it best fits. So I spent a year being anonymous, making this podcast, and then decided to be me. This is that moment. Hello and welcome to the Fertility Podcast. Now, it's been a while since I've put an episode out, because I'm currently touring the UK, visiting a whole host of clinics working with Access Fertility. The reason I'm doing that is to give you an insight into what different clinics are like. It's something different that I haven't done before on the Fertility Podcast. I'm working with Access Fertility, they're sponsoring me, which is really exciting. But it means that I haven't been putting out the regular episodes as you might expect. So I just wanted to explain why. There's been lots going on. My little boy has turned 1, and you might have seen on Twitter I came out. I told you who I was, because if you've listened to this podcast from the start, you'll know that I chose to do it anonymously. The reason for that, my husband and I just didn't want everybody knowing what we had experienced. Now, I've had a number of emails from people saying you talk about fertility being a taboo subject, yet you do your podcast anonymously. And my reason was that I really wanted to do something for the fertility world, for people like you and me who have found themselves on a journey that they didn't expect. And my background in radio and podcasting meant that it just seemed really natural for me to try and put information out for you to hear, people like yourself sharing their stories, to hear from experts, wellbeing people, hopefully find this really useful. And the feedback that I've had from you has been that that is what you found from the podcast. However, I found it quite challenging not just being me, saying who I am, being the fertility poddy. So
I talked about it with my other half, and we both agreed, why not? Why not just embrace it? And it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to shout about this on my personal Facebook, telling all my friends so that they're all asking me about this and our treatment. And I'd be interested to know how you feel about that, because I know a lot of you go through this secretly. I know that some of you are really open with people. The emails that I have, some of you tell me that you tell everybody about your treatment, and I wholeheartedly respect you for doing that. But I also wholeheartedly respect you if you choose to keep it to yourself. What I will say is that there are so many support networks out there, in particular in UK, or even if you have a sense that one of your friends or some of your work colleagues might have been through treatment, you probably are right. Remember, 1 in 6 couples are affected with infertility. Now, I'm not saying if you've chosen to keep this to yourself, go and shout that you're now, having treatment or you've had treatment. But what I'm saying to you is that I'm Natalie, hi, and I'm feeling quite relieved that I'm just going to continue on with the Fertility Podcast as me, being more open, because I've always been open and I've always been honest, and I hope that you felt that from the podcast that you've listened to. So, moving forwards, I'm very soon to release this season of podcasts sponsored by Access Fertility, which I really hope you'll be interested in. I've got a few bits and bobs that I'm going to put out from people that I've met on Twitter, and I really encourage you to get in touch. I really want to hear from you. I want to know how you're feeling. I've been doing this podcast out of love, and it's a kind of labour of love in some respects, in that it's not something I'm paid for until now, with the brilliant sponsorship of Access Fertility for this chunk of work. So that's why there's been a bit of a gap from me, because I've had to concentrate on some paid work, as you would expect, whilst looking after my little one, who's now going to a childminder, which is really exciting. Gives me a little bit of time to just do a bit of recording like I'm doing now. But I'd love to hear from you, so you can get in touch and tell me your story. Tell me if there's certain things that you would like to hear about on the Fertility Podcast. Is there an expert whose book you've been reading that you would just love to ask them more questions? Is there a forum that you're in that you want to tell me about? Is there an event that you've been to? Whatever it is that has helped you, just get in touch. So there's different ways you can do that. You can email Natalie at thefertilitypodcast.com, or you can tweet me at thefertilitypoddy. Really easy. I'd love to hear from you.
What do you make of that jazz music? I might have to add a bit more of that into future recordings. So yeah, that was me telling you about my coming out, and also about my first amount of sponsorship for the podcast. If you're now into podcasts, you'll know that it's a funny world. It's kind of gone crazy more recently. The last couple of years, more people are podcasting, more people are getting involved in sponsoring podcasts, but it is a constant sell, and I still have a full-time job. I'm a voiceover artist, as well as doing the different things that I've been doing in the fertility space, and getting this podcast sponsored to make it possible is a kind of ongoing part of what I'm doing. However, that moment of me just being totally upfront and open about what my future plans were started me on a different path with the podcast. And as I've been working out, and my husband have been working out what's happening next in our world, watching as well what you all share, there's various things along the way that I have talked more about. And we have our beautiful boy Phoenix, and we have frozen embryos, and that conversation is something I've learnt that lots of us aren't talking about enough. That decision of what to do with our frozen embryos. So I spoke about it just at the end of 2018 about how I felt. Now, it was literally recorded on New Year's Eve, and the recording does start with a little interlude from Phoenix, my little boy. So if hearing a small person talk is in any way of a trigger right now, maybe skip forward 10-20 seconds, or just enjoy him being pretty cute if it's not a trigger.
I hurt my arm.
How did you hurt your arm?
When I was on the table.
When you're on the table?
Yeah.
What are you doing? I'm just recording. You can sit here. You can sit here, but you need to be really quiet. You can say something.
Why?
Do you want to say Happy New Year? Say Happy New Year to all of the Fertility Podcast listeners.
I need these on.
All right, put the headphones on. All right. So remember, say Happy New Year
Happy New Year.
to all the Fertility Podcast listeners.
Or to all of the Fertility Podcast listeners.
Brilliant. Well done. Thank you. Excuse the brief interlude. That was my son, Phoenix. I'm literally being as spontaneous as I can be and have not edited that bit out. Phoenix is going to be 4 in March. He's the result of our successful ICSI treatment that we had in 2014. So he was born March 2015. And I started the podcast once I was pregnant with him. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about in this episode is where we are at, because I haven't really talked a huge amount because I've not really been sure of what I wanted to say. Through this year, I've talked a bit about being in that secondary infertility space, which is a strange place to be in that we are blessed to have a child and we are still trying to work out what happens next. And that's what this year for my husband and I has really been about. We were fortunate enough to have 3 frozen embryos, and I think at the time we thought we'd have a second child because it's what both of us wanted. We're both siblings. However, as time has gone on and our circumstances have changed, we've relocated to Manchester. My husband has changed careers. My career obviously had a break because I also work as a radio presenter and voiceover artist as well as doing this podcast. So I had a kind of career break whilst Phoenix was really small. Never stopped working. I've been making this podcast and doing voiceover work, but I haven't been able to work full time until this September. And one of the things that I personally have been struggling with is the reality of having a second child. Financially, we are wanting to buy a house. We still don't own because both of our careers have moved us around and we've been renting. And where we've moved now, our plan is to buy a house. So the reality is that for me to come out of work, which I would do if I was to have a second child, isn't really viable. And so that kind of head over heart dialogue that has been going on has been something that I've been struggling with. And so I reached out to Hannah, which is a Jewish infertility charity. By chance, really, I'd started talking with them because I wanted to know more about what they did. I'm Jewish. I felt that my personal faith belief system had been challenged somewhat as a result of our fertility struggles. And so I've been having conversations for about 6 months with one of their counsellors to try and work out kind of what support I need. So I haven't actually been having counselling from them yet, but what we have been doing is talking through where my head is at about the decision as to whether or not we have further treatment or whether we let go of our embryos. And I was absolutely adamant that whatever the outcome is, the embryos are not going to be left to perish, which is the awful term given to making that decision. And I am going to be talking in the new year, in 2019, about what we do with our frozen embryos, because I think it's something that we don't talk about enough. And I think that as fertility patients, we're not really given the opportunity to think about that during treatment. Obviously, you just want to have the treatment and have success. And if you get frozen embryos, then that in itself is a blessing, because I know not all of you are fortunate enough to get any frosties, as we'll call them. We this year have had the letter from our clinic asking us to pay for the storage, which was due in June. And I didn't want to pay it because I felt that we've spent a significant amount of money on the storage already. And I felt that my husband and I had reached a point where we'd both, in all honesty, agreed that having a second child wasn't really the best thing for us, in that we have a wonderful little boy. We are blessed to have our family unit at 3. And whilst we both had this dream of having 2 children, my age, I'm 41 now, and our work kind of set up and our financial position doesn't make it the best option. And in an ideal, we want to give our little boy everything and the best of everything. And if that means that we then have to manage our own guilt of him not having a sibling, that I think that's something that we have to manage, because he's a brilliant little boy. And whilst I think he'd be an amazing bigger brother, if it doesn't happen, he will still be an amazing little boy and an amazing person. So this is all stuff that I've been working through. And the reason that I've left this podcast episode till today is because last night was finally the kind of chance that my husband and I had some time, just the two of us, to talk about all of this. Because where I've got to with the counselling type conversations I've been having with Hannah is that the lady I've been talking to and offloading my brain has suggested that the best type of counselling that we could and should look to have is implications counselling, to help us with that decision of giving our embryos over to science, which is the plan that I have in my mind. Is that's the best thing that I feel I'd be comfortable doing. I was 36 at the time of having treatment, so the embryos are too old to be donated, and I don't know how I'd feel about that. As much as I'd love to help another couple, I just think it would play on my mind so much. And I know that this will play on my mind anyway, because in my heart I feel that we will get our house and we will be in a better financial position. And then what if I turn around and say, well, now I'm ready to have a second child? However, in my head, I'm saying it's not guaranteed to work, a frozen embryo transfer. I don't know if I am actually mentally capable of having a second child, because my business in itself is like a second child. If you work for yourself, you'll know when you are your own boss and you've got so many plates to spin, adding in a little person that you have to care for is a challenge. And to add in a baby when you've got a little person and your own business, I just honestly don't feel it's something that I could manage. We could manage. And so the conversation that my husband and I had last night was that he said he would be 100% up for the counselling, which we've talked about before. But he was also saying that he feels I probably need to address more than he does. And I know what he meant by that, in that I feel that maternal urge that I should have a second child probably stronger than he does. And if you're a guy listening to this, feel free to get in touch and tell me whether you've had urges for a second child, because I do think it sits more with the woman. I'm not saying that guys don't want more. I know plenty of girlfriends that had their other halves going, more, let's have another baby, and they've been fortunate enough to do it naturally, or they've gone for more fertility treatment. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying in a pretty long-winded way is I feel that I can honestly say to you that I'm starting 2019 with a bit more of a clearer focus that we are going to potentially give these embryos over to science. And I'm getting a bit teary saying it, but I think it's the best thing to do. And I'm going to have some implications counselling and talk through all the feelings. And then I'd like to document that process of giving the embryos to science for you. I've asked my clinic if that's something that could be possible, and they've said yes. Because I think that there is such a lack of understanding about it. It's like the unknown, and I think that that's why we're fearful of it, making this decision, because we don't really know what it means. So I hope that in my next step of my journey, I hope that in my next step of my journey, I can help educate you a bit more, which is what this podcast is all about. The Fertility Podcast is my mission to help us all understand this weird place we find ourselves in. Sorry, I hope that didn't get you and make you upset, especially if you're on the move and it's the start of your day. But you know what? I'm recording this in October 2019, almost a year on from sharing that episode, and we've not signed the forms. That is how long this process is taking. I've been through implications counselling, and if you follow me on social media, you'll know that I shared that my husband and I had a joint implications counselling session. where we're at is that we've told our clinic that we're going to donate the embryos to science, and then we've had this second round, and I might have shared this already on the podcast. Forgive me if I have, because I know I've been sharing it on my social media platforms as well. We signed the forms to say we'll donate the embryos to science, and then you get a second bout of forms to kind of say, are you sure? And everything's halted because I don't know if I'm sure. I'm not 100% sure. I'm like 99% sure, and I'm just toying with that 1% curiosity, because there's 99% of me that is accepting where I'm at, is content where I'm at, but there is 1% of me that wonders what it would be like. So that's where my head is at, and I will be talking more about it with you, both on my social media platforms and here. I'm going to end this podcast episode now, because I'm going to be sharing another one with you later this week, all about the fertility show, some of the speakers that are going to be joining me on the Let's Talk Fertility stage, because the fertility show in London is happening at the end of this month, 1st, 2nd, 3rd of November. More on that. One thing I'll ask is do go and follow me on my social platforms, whatever you prefer. I'm at Fertility Poddy on Instagram and Twitter, and the Fertility Podcast is the page on Facebook, because as part of this 5th birthday celebration, I'm going to be announcing something on Wednesday this week that I'm offering 5 people. So I'll tell you more about it on my socials, and we'll talk more about it in my next episode. Thank you as always for your support. 5 years of your support. It's just, honestly, I'm going to just harp on about it for a little bit longer, I think, over the coming weeks, because it's phenomenal that in October, 5 years on from starting this, I'm still making this podcast. It really is something special, and I'm really, really proud of me and you and us and what we've been doing, and how we've encouraged other podcasters, and how there's just more conversations, and I do feel a little bit responsible for making it a little easier to talk about. So until the next time.